Ardent, as someone who's devoted her professional life to doing the science and making sure it's translated into policy and practice, in thanking Representative Cassidy for really having the courage to care about it and to do something about it. I think what's happening here today and yesterday and what's happening in Congress is the beginning of a movement for parents to say, I care about my child. I want to make sure that my child receives the diagnosis, the intervention, and the accommodations he or she needs. And for teachers to be taught how to teach and recognize and teach dyslexic children, and the dyslexic children themselves, not only to get a diagnosis and an intervention, but to receive the accommodations that make all the difference in the world. So Representative Cassidy and his team, including Dr. Laura Cassidy and all the wonderful people who are part of the Cassidy staff, thank you from the 1 in 5, and that's a lot of people. So what we're going to talk about at this conference, which is the past, present, and future of dyslexia, is the science of reading and dyslexia and translating the research into practice. Dyslexia has been around for a very long time. In fact, I'm sure since people first learned to read. But what really, oh, can we lower the lights? What's really interesting, not only has it been around a long time, over 100 years ago, a British physician in England described the first case. Dr. W. Pringle Morgan, in November of 1896 in the British Medical Journal, published a case of congenital word blindness. And he wanted to explain a child that had come to see him that seemed to be bright in every way, but he couldn't read. And I like to share this description of Percy with you. Percy was, I think, about 14, because it fits the children we see in 2012. And here's his description. He has always been a bright and intelligent boy, in no way inferior to others of his age. His great difficulty has been, and is now, his inability to learn to read. And then Dr. Morgan goes on to indicate Percy could be the brightest in his class were it not for his reading difficulty. So that was in 1896. What about in 2012? And what I'm going to show you now are two video clips. One will be of this lovely young lady, Sky Lucas, who's now 13, who's reflecting on what happened. She went to a school, and she couldn't read. So when she was in first grade, that school asked her to leave because they didn't want to deal with dyslexic students. She went to a special school for dyslexic children, and she's now a blossoming, lovely young lady. But I want you to hear her thoughts on reflecting on it and what a mother thinks when a child has these difficulties.
This picture. Was me in first grade at Riverdale. Yeah, this picture was taken at school. And there are the kids reading over there, but I couldn't read yet, so I would just sit at my table and draw. Oh, this picture.
I felt so badly for Sky, and I remember thinking, like, where does she belong? And how traumatic to start off school thinking that she can't succeed in first grade.
That's Sky, but what I think all of you know is this is happening in so many households and so many families and so many classrooms all over, not only Baton Rouge, Louisiana, all over the country, and indeed all over the world. And I want to share with you the content of some of the emails people have been writing to us personally or to our Yale Center. For example, tests show my son is dyslexic, but the school doesn't acknowledge it because he falls in the average range, even though the discrepancy is huge and he is struggling so. I was told my daughter was too bright to be dyslexic. And indeed, I just received an email yesterday from a concerned parent whose school told them that, well, your child can read, so it can't be dyslexic. The thinking that, well, to be dyslexic, you have to be totally unable to read, that's absolutely not true, but we'll talk more about that. And here's one, my child's school doesn't believe in dyslexia. And what I always say, you know, we as human beings can choose which religion to believe in or not to believe in. That's our, you know, prerogative. But dyslexia is based on scientific fact. It's not something you believe in or you don't believe in. I mean, do you believe in heart disease? Or do you eliminate that too and say, well, we don't believe in heart disease? Well, you have chest pain, well, we don't believe in it, so we can't take care of it. That's ridiculous. So we can't say we don't believe in it. And we'll share some of the scientific data with you in a few minutes. And here's another parent. I am fighting to have an evaluation for my child. And dyslexia doesn't go away, so now that he's an adult, anxiety affects every part of his life. And here's from a young woman. My dyslexia was caught late. Now, once again, I've hit a roadblock. I need to take the LSATs to go to law school, but they won't let me use my prior evaluation. And I just don't have the money. I can't afford to get retested. And it just seems to be an unnecessary, never-ending battle. And I think you all are the ground troops. And I see it all over the country. As Representative Cassidy was saying, the circle's getting bigger and bigger of people who say, this is real, this is hurting people, this is hurting society, and we have to do something about it. So this morning, we're going to talk about dyslexia, what it is, what the scientific basis is, what is the epidemiology that means, who's affected, how many, what happens over time, what is the cognitive basis, why are otherwise intelligent children and adults dyslexic, what is happening in the brain so that children and adults who are bright in every way are not able to retrieve words quickly or to read rapidly. And then to really talk about why it is important to use the word dyslexia, because it has meaning, to identify, to intervene in, and to accommodate dyslexia. You know, we talk about learning disabilities. It's important for each one of you to know that if we took 100 children identified as learning disability, 80% or more would be dyslexic. So dyslexia is not the only learning disability, but it's by far and away the very, very most common. And yet, it's often as we just heard, diagnosed or misdiagnosed, inadequately treated, and associated with growing anxiety. And this represents a human capital loss to the child, his or her family, and indeed to society. It's always good to start with a definition. And in dyslexia, we have a long-standing definition that goes back to Dr. Morgan. And as you'll hear in a few minutes, we now have empiric evidence to support. So dyslexia is an unexpected difficulty in reading, unexpected in relation to that individual's intelligence, their motivation, their level of education, and their professional status. So you could be a 40-year-old attorney who can represent his or her clients well, but who is dyslexic and reads slowly, or you can be a physician, or an architect, or a writer, or a stay-at-home mom. And this is a study that we are so excited about. It was published in 2010 in the journal Psychologic Science. I direct a study called the Connecticut Longitudinal Study that I'll tell you about in a minute. And in that study, we have monitored a large group of Connecticut school children from the moment they entered kindergarten, and they're now in their 30s. And every other year, we administered the Wechsler Intelligence Scales for Children, and every year the Woodcock-Johnson reading test. And we asked the question, what happens, what is the relationship between reading and intelligence over time? And what we find is if you look at this slide, these are the typical readers. The straight line is intelligence, the dotted line is reading, and the jargony term is they're dynamically linked. My term is they're kissing cousins. They go together over time. You know, wherever you go, I go. So your intelligence score 1 year will influence your reading score the next year. Your reading score will influence your intelligence. They really do go together. And that sort of conforms with what most of us think. If you're very smart, you'll probably be a pretty good reader. If you're not so smart, you won't be such a good reader. Okay. But clever that we are, we also had a large group of dyslexic students, and we said, well, let's apply the same statistical analysis comparing intelligence and reading in children who are dyslexic. Not only weren't they kissing cousins, they weren't even talking to one another. As you can see here, here's intelligence, and here's reading. Look at that big difference. This is the unexpected. Given this level of intelligence, here is the reading. And this is the empiric validation of the unexpected nature of dyslexia. And what we've also learned, and this is a concept that Bennett and I formulated and I presented in my book, Overcoming Dyslexia, and it's the Sea of Strengths model of dyslexia. And that says dyslexia can best be conceptualized as an encapsulated weakness in getting to the sounds of words. But at the same time, surrounded by a sea of strengths and higher level cognitive function, concept formation, comprehension, general knowledge, problem solving, critical thinking. And what we need to do is we need to identify the weakness, but also identify the strengths. We want to remediate the weakness, but also make sure that that child or young adult or adult has access to their strengths. And that's usually done by accommodations. And what I like to point out is we've learned, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, a lot about teaching reading. But it's hard to teach thinking. And people who are dyslexic do very well in thinking. So what have we learned about the epidemiology? As I mentioned, the Connecticut longitudinal study began. I always sort of hesitate to say this because I see people cackling, how old is she? Or when did she start this? Well, it started when I was a child in 1983. It's an interesting story. I was asked at Yale to see children who had learning problems. And so suddenly here I am, a physician. What do I do with a child who comes to me with their family with a learning problem? And as I reviewed the literature, I realized that there was a great deal written about children who had already been identified by schools or clinics, but very little about children who might struggle to read but were not noticed, or sitting in their class quietly. So we designed this study to be representative of all children entering public kindergarten in 1983. We went into 14 different towns of all sorts. They were balanced for ethnicity, socioeconomic status, geography, and we enrolled 445 children, and that was about 98% of all those eligible. And we have followed those children from the moment they entered kindergarten through grade school, through high school. Some graduated, some did not. Some went to Yale, some went to jail. And we've learned more about jail than we ever wanted to know. It's not a good place. And now they're in their 30s, and we continue to monitor them. And we have a remarkable retention rate. And so what have we learned? One is how common it is. 1 in 5. That's 10 million children in the United States. That's probably the most common neuropsychiatric entity, more common than anything else you can think of. But because it's hidden, people don't notice. And my job today, if I do it well, will be to explain to you what dyslexia is, so that you too can recognize it and people don't have to go unrecognized. And also, what I'm thrilled about is more and more people are coming out and identifying themselves. And I think that's important because there's so many wonderful people who are dyslexic. It's a group, as I said earlier, you want to meet. So every class has children who are struggling readers. Bennett, Shaywitz, and I visit classes very, very often. And when we go, we spend a long time in the class. And I'll ask a teacher, do you have any dyslexic children in your class? And I'll often, oh no, I don't have those children. And I think to myself, yes, you do. It's a shame you don't recognize them because they're there in every single class. Dyslexia affects both boys and girls. It used to be thought it was only boys. And we actually examined that. So if you ask teachers to identify children, they'll pick a lot more boys. And you don't need to have a degree from Yale to know why. Who's causing you a problem, who's throwing airplanes across the room or calling out. And those are the children often sent for an evaluation, but the little girl who may be sitting very quietly but not reading is often overlooked. So when you look statistically at children in the broadest, most in-depth way, there are a few more boys, but not significantly more. And one of the most important messages I hope you all take home today, but I think so many of you don't need me to tell you that, dyslexia doesn't go away. It's not episodic, it's lifelong. So the 5-year-old, 6-year-old that's dyslexic will be the 15-year-old, will be the 25, 55, and if you live that long, the 95. And believe me, I've gotten mail, actually, just the other day from someone 84 telling me about their dyslexia. So it doesn't go away. You can help it be better, but the person's always going to be dyslexic. And it's not a developmental it's something that is part of a child or an adult, and it persists. In our study, we looked at what do dyslexic children look like at high school compared to non-dyslexic. What we found was the reading growth rate is the highest in early grades. It goes up and then it asymptotes. So what does that mean? You want to get those kids while that growth rate is really accelerating. And also, so importantly, persistently poor readers in early grades, they don't catch up. They really don't. And we measured phonologic awareness, and I'll speak more about that. The ability to get to the sounds of spoken words. That, even in high school, even in adulthood, discriminates typical readers from dyslexic readers. So the message is we have to get to children in the early grades. Don't wait, it's not going to go away. And what you do is, I always think of the example of my sister-in-law and brother-in-law. They bought a house that they were going to remodel. And they had to take it apart, redo it, and then make it right. They never finished. Why not start when you don't have to take apart all the wrong things that have been done, and you can start with that really clean slate and get those connections going early on, and also before the child becomes so anxious and loses self-esteem. So early reading experience is critical. It has a lasting effect on later academic success. No matter what the study, if it's looked at first grade, third grade, sixth grade, here I quote a first grade study, if a child is a poor reader at the end of first grade, unless that child receives an evidence-based intervention that I'll talk about later on, that child will rarely achieve average level reading by the end of elementary school and beyond. Dyslexia is universal. It's not only in Baton Rouge. It's not only in New York or Ohio or California. And one way I've learned about it is to look at the science coming from different countries. But another way is my book has been translated into Chinese, Korean, Japanese, Croatian. I can go on. And here you see a cover of the book in Japanese. And Bennett and I had the pleasure of visiting Japan. and lecturing, but also in this picture, you see me, and this is a group, this is a teacher, and these are children who are Japanese and dyslexic, and their parents. And even though we required a translator speaking to those children and their families, I could have been in Baton Rouge. I could have been in New Haven, Connecticut. It's the same because it's universal. And here, the Japanese now have gotten interested, and I was meeting with one of the ministers of education. So this is a worldwide condition. It's inherent in who we are as human beings. So I've just said people who are dyslexic are bright, but they struggle to retrieve words and speak. Why would that be? Why, if you're motivated and bright, do you have a difficulty like that? And I want to talk now about the nature of reading and reading disability. And it comes the question, why does print have meaning? Why, when each one of us looks at the slide, how do we know that these circles and lines represent letters, and the letters make words, and the words have meaning? The good news is, while there's always more to learn, we know enough to begin to really understand this at a very deep level. So I think the best way to do that is to separate what we know about spoken language from what we know about written language. Let's look at spoken language. Spoken language has been around a very, very long time, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years. And we as human beings are programmed for spoken language. Wherever you go in the world, people speak. And spoken language is natural. It's instinctive. You don't have to teach a child how to speak. You don't have to go and get the spoken language curriculum. And I'm so delighted to meet so many grandparents here today who care about their dyslexic grandchild. And if you needed to get a curriculum to teach a child spoken language, this is one grandmother who would have done that. But I haven't, and I just want to show you a clip.
America. Land that I love. Stand beside her, guide her through the day with the light from above.
It's just an example of here a child starts out, cooing and being able to babble and speak. It's natural, it's instinctive. It happens. We don't need to teach it. So that's spoken language. What about written language, print, reading? That's very different. First of all, it's not been around as long as spoken language, maybe 5,000 to 6,000 years compared to hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years. There are still societies on Earth that don't have a written language. I was speaking with one of our physicians at Yale Medical School who is dyslexic, and he's from Africa. And he was telling me that his parents' native language doesn't have a print. It's only a spoken language. And we also know that our brains, while our brains are hardwired for spoken language, they're not hardwired for print. So as opposed to spoken language, which is natural, which is instinctive, and doesn't have to be taught, written language is acquired, it's artificial, and it has to be taught. That's a huge difference. So then the question is, what do you have to teach so that the lines and circles of print take on meaning? They have to be connected to something that has inherent meaning. And what has inherent meaning are the sounds of spoken language. So here you can see on this slide, the lines and circles of print take on meaning when they're linked to spoken language, particularly and especially to the sounds, the phonology. And the linguist, Leonard Bloomfield, got it right when he was trying to describe the relationship between print and spoken language, and he said, writing is a way of recording spoken language by visible marks. So when we think of the language system, whether it's for speaking or reading, we concentrate on a very, very small unit of spoken language, the smallest unit called a phoneme. It's the smallest unit of speech distinguishing one word from another. In English, there are about 44 phonemes. People quibble, some say 45. But I'd like you to think about it as the common building blocks of all spoken and written words. So here's an example, the word cat. Sounds like one piece of sound, but you can pull it apart into three, k, a, and t. And here I'd like to show you in this cartoon what the mechanism is. So if I want to say the word cat, I think of it, I may picture a cat in my mind, and then I have to go into my internal dictionary and pull out the sounds, the k, the t, the a, and then serially order them and say the word. Most of us who are not dyslexic, we don't even think about it. We just do it. It's automatic and really quick. If you're dyslexic, and we don't know why, for some reason, these building blocks are not as crisp or clear as they are for a typical reader. So that means when we try to go into our internal dictionary and retrieve the word, it's harder. It takes longer, and I'll tell you the mechanism in a little bit. And what happens, we often pull out the wrong sound. So if I wanted to, a parent told me, a child, they live in New York City, and they would drive past the Cloisters Museum, and every time they passed, the little boy would say, "Oh, mommy, mommy, there it is again, the oysters." Cloisters, oysters. And this happens to people who are dyslexic because they can't access and retrieve the individual sounds. And reading is really just the converse. You start with the intact word, and what you have to be able to do is appreciate that you can pull this word apart and connect the letters to the individual sounds, the k, the a, the t, blend the sounds together, and identify the word. Now, I'm saying it, no problem, and if you're not dyslexic, it's not. And I think one of the great difficulties is because if you're not dyslexic, it comes so easy, and if you're dyslexic, it comes so hard. And that is what gives people such a difficulty. So in order to learn to read, children have to master what's called the alphabetic principle. That is, they have to develop the awareness that words, spoken words, are not just a whole envelope of sound, but you can pull it apart, and the segments represent the sounds. The example again, cat, k, a, and t. Because once a child can do that, then they can link the letter to the sounds. So once a child develops this awesome awareness, usually by the end of first grade or so, sometimes earlier, that the printed word has the same number and sequence of sounds as the spoken word, we say they're ready to read. And now the alphabetic principle is really extraordinarily helpful. It's informed our and other scientists' neurobiologic paradigms in studying the brain in dyslexia. It guides the identification of dyslexic children, this difficulty getting to the sounds of spoken words, and it's the basis of effective instruction and intervention strategies.